Mason Hart only needed the room that the attorney had already paid for, but CEO Celeste Ashcroft looked at his faded jacket and called the single father a fortune hunter. She tore up his reservation confirmation, slammed his mother's old ring onto the front desk, and ordered security to escort him out of the hotel. Mason had barely turned toward the door when the convoy of billionaire Gideon Ashcroft pulled to a stop outside. The founder walked in, holding a sealed DNA report, looked at Mason with trembling hands, and spoke one word that stopped Celeste cold: "Son." Subscribe to this channel and stay with us to watch the moment a scorned father becomes the heir who brought a hotel empire to its knees. The Greyhound pulled into the Port Authority terminal just before 5 in the morning, and Mason Hart stepped off the bus with a duffel bag over one shoulder, a toolkit tucked under his arm, and a plain white envelope folded inside his breast pocket. He had spent most of the overnight ride from Springfield, Missouri, in silence, watching small towns give way to highway and highway give way to the sprawling lit outline of Manhattan, a city he had never had a reason to visit until now. Marion Shaw, the attorney who had tracked him down 6 weeks earlier, had given him a hotel confirmation number, a folder of documents he was not supposed to open until their meeting, and a single instruction: do not tell anyone at Ashcroft Imperial why you are there. He had carried that instruction carefully, the way he carried everything difficult in his life, quietly and without complaint, because Mason Hart had learned long ago that explaining yourself to strangers rarely went the way you hoped. He had left Leah with a neighbor, told her he would be back in 2 days, and promised to call when he arrived. He had not told her what the envelope contained, or what the envelope meant, because he did not yet know himself whether the answer he found in New York would be the kind a 15-year-old girl needed to carry. He took the subway uptown and arrived at the corner of the block that held Ashcroft Imperial just as the morning light was turning the glass and limestone facade a pale gold. The hotel was the kind of place that seemed to exist in a separate atmosphere from the sidewalk around it. A doorman in a charcoal uniform moving as if he had rehearsed the motion, a revolving door polished to the sharpness of a mirror, and a low hum of classical music that somehow reached the street. Mason stood on that sidewalk for a moment and told himself it didn't matter. The room had been paid for, he had the confirmation number, and he was there for one reason and one reason only, a reason that had nothing to do with money, inheritance, or the name of the family whose crest appeared on the hotel's brass signage. He walked through the doors. The lobby hit him like a shift in air pressure. Cold marble floors, ceiling chandeliers throwing small white stars across the walls, clusters of leather furniture occupied by people in clothes whose price tags Mason could not have estimated and did not try to. A bellhop walked past a family with luggage on a cart and went straight to greet a man in a tailored overcoat stepping from a town car. Near the service entrance, a delivery driver in a rain jacket was being redirected to the back of the building, even though the rain outside was steady and the building's overhang extended another 20 feet. Mason noticed these things the way a technician notices the sounds a machine makes before it breaks down. Not with judgment, just with attention. Tessa Monroe was working the front desk and greeted Mason with the same polite standard she used with every guest who approached the counter, asking for his name and pulling up the reservation without visible hesitation. She found it immediately, a room booked through the Ashcroft family legal office, paid in full, with a note in the system that read, "Guest of the Ashcroft legal office, reservation not to be modified." She was reaching for the key folder when Preston Keene walked past the desk, glanced at the name on her screen, and stopped. He took in the canvas jacket, the worn boots, the repair stitched into the corner of the duffel bag, and made the kind of rapid assessment that people who have spent years operating inside hierarchies develop as a reflex. He excused himself from the desk floor and walked toward the back corridor with his phone already in his hand. Preston made the call to Celeste from the narrow corridor behind the front desk, speaking in the clipped, efficient register he reserved for information he believed she would want to act on immediately. Celeste Ashcroft had been on the 38th floor, moving between two members of the board she was hosting for a dinner that would double as a preview of the expansion proposal she had spent the last 11 months preparing. She listened to Preston for less than 30 seconds, set down her champagne glass, and excused herself from the table with a smile that gave nothing away. She took the elevator down, not because the situation required her personal attention, but because she had decided, based on everything she had heard in the past 2 weeks about a man named Mason Hart from a small town in Missouri, that he needed to understand clearly and publicly that the front door of Ashcroft Imperial was not the entry point to anything he believed it was. She brought 2 board members with her, which she arranged without making it look arranged, because witnesses at the right moment were a form of evidence. She crossed the lobby and walked directly to the spot where Mason was standing near the front desk, and looked at him in the way she had learned to look at situations she needed to assess quickly. Starting at the surface and working inward, she saw a faded canvas jacket with a frayed collar, work boots that had been cleaned but not recently, a duffel bag with a repair stitched at one corner, and a man who looked back at her without flinching. She asked him where he had gotten his information about her family. Mason told her that Marion Shaw had contacted him, that the room had been properly reserved, and that he was there for a meeting he had agreed to in advance. He did not mention the DNA test, because he had promised Marion he would not, and Mason Hart was not the kind of person who broke a promise because the situation became uncomfortable. Celeste looked at the plain white envelope tucked in his hand and told him she would need to see what was inside. He opened it and handed her the contents without argument, because he was not there to hide anything. There was a photograph of a young woman and a young man standing in front of a building that no longer looked the way it did now, a ring with a small crest engraved on the inside of the band, half of a printed event ticket with a date from more than 4 decades earlier, and a sealed letter that Marion had told him not to open without her. Celeste held the photograph for a moment, then set it down with the controlled calm of someone who had taught herself not to show surprise in public. She said the items could have been purchased at any estate sale, or fabricated by someone willing to do a little research. Mason told her she could call Marion to verify the reservation and the nature of his visit. Celeste did not call, because she understood that if Marion confirmed the appointment, the evening she had carefully planned would need to be rebuilt from the foundation, and she was not ready to concede that ground. She looked at him steadily and said that arriving with a handful of old objects did not make a person a member of any family. Mason said that he had not arrived claiming to be a member of any family, only that he had a room and a reason to be in the building. The distinction appeared to irritate her more than agreement would have. Tessa interjected carefully, pointing out that the reservation in the system had been confirmed and paid by the legal office, and that, under the hotel's own policy, a booking could not be voided without the written consent of the party who had made it. Preston stepped between her and the desk, walked her 3 steps to the side with a pressure that was professional in its surface and unmistakably firm underneath, and told her in a low voice that her job was to make sure the guests who belonged at Ashcroft Imperial felt welcome, and that deciding who belonged, there was not a function she needed to perform. He logged into the system using his general manager credentials, and, in fewer than 2 minutes, transferred Mason's room to a preferred guest who had arrived without a reservation and was waiting in the lounge. When Mason asked why his room no longer appeared in the system, Preston told him that Ashcroft Imperial reserved the right to exercise discretion in accommodations when a situation created what he called a reputational risk. a phrase that carried no legal definition and all the weight of someone who had used it often enough to make it sound official. Celeste asked Mason if he would like to present a credit card for the deposit required of walk-in guests, and Mason placed his card on the desk because he had nothing to be ashamed of. Preston took the card, looked at it for a moment, and handed it back, without running it, then said loudly enough for the nearest cluster of guests to hear that the hotel's deposit structure could not be met with the card presented. A statement with no basis in fact, but one that landed in the lobby's ambient sound the way a stone lands in water, spreading outward in all directions. Several guests turned to look. Mason did not look back at them. He understood what was happening. Not a misunderstanding, not a policy dispute, but a performance designed to reshape the definition of who he was before anyone in that room had a chance to form their own opinion. Celeste then offered him a sum of money in cash, which she described as a courtesy, in exchange for his signature on a document agreeing not to contact any media outlet or reference the Ashcroft family in any public forum. Mason looked at the envelope on the counter, and then at her, and said that she already knew he had a valid reservation, and that whether or not she believed anything else about him, that part was not in question. He did not take the money. Tessa, standing at the far end of the desk, quietly took a photograph of her own screen before the reservation disappeared entirely, saving an image that showed the booking's confirmation number, the legal office's name, and the timestamp of the deletion. Mason looked at Preston and then at Celeste, and said, with no raised edge in his voice, that he had come to meet someone who might be able to answer a question that had sat at the center of his life for 42 years, and that the question was not about money. He said he only needed to know whether a man named Gideon Ashcroft had ever been told that he had a son. No one answered that question. Preston turned to adjust something on the desk. Celeste looked past him as if he had said something in a language she had chosen not to learn. Celeste told Mason he was welcome to wait in the public seating area until the attorney arrived, but said it in a tone that made clear she expected no confirmation to arrive in any form that would change the outcome she had already decided on. Mason sat in one of the lobby chairs and did not make noise, did not approach any other guests, did not pull out his phone to document anything, because he had not come to build a case. He sat with the particular stillness of a person who has already absorbed more than most people are asked to carry. The same stillness he had kept in hospital corridors during his mother's final months, when the news was never going to be good and patience was the only thing left that was entirely his. Preston walked past him twice, and on the second pass he raised his voice in a remark directed at a bellhop about the hotel's atmosphere and the impressions made on serious guests when the lobby's standards were not maintained. Celeste, speaking clearly within Mason's earshot, told one of the nearby board members that it was unfortunately common for people from rural backgrounds to conflate access to a public space with entitlement to a private institution, a statement precise in its condescension and completely audible to everyone within 15 feet. Mason did not respond to either of them. He turned his head slightly and looked up at the ventilation system running along the upper edge of the lobby, then at the return duct above the entrance to the ballroom wing, and he heard something in the system's rhythm that did not belong. A vibration cycling at an interval that a technician who had spent 20 years in the field would recognize as a pre-failure pattern. He told Preston that the air handling unit feeding the ballroom corridor was running at a compressed cycle that would likely push it past safe load capacity within a few hours, especially if the ballroom was at full capacity with catering equipment and lighting rigs. Preston looked at him and said that a traveling repairman from the Midwest was not qualified to provide technical guidance to a 5-star Manhattan hotel. Celeste picked up the ring that had come from the envelope, held it for a moment, and said that the Ashcroft crest was not a symbol that belonged in the hands of people who arrived by bus with a toolkit, and she placed it down on the counter with a motion that was not quite a throw, but was not gentle either. Tessa walked to the desk and picked the ring up and brought it to Mason without being asked, and Preston told her that her shift was suspended effective immediately and that she was to go to the staff office and wait for the human resources coordinator. Mason told Preston that Tessa should not face consequences for doing what was right. Celeste told him that decisions about hotel staffing were entirely outside anything he had a right to address. Mason looked at Celeste steadily and said, very quietly, that she might be correct about that today, but that someday she would have to explain to someone why the only person in the building who acted with integrity was the one she sent home for it. Elliot Crane arrived in the lobby with 2 members of his security team and stopped at the desk first to speak with Preston, who told him that Mason was impersonating a person with a family connection to the Ashcrofts and had been causing a disturbance. Elliot looked at the camera feeds on the tablet he carried and saw a man sitting in a lobby chair who had not raised his voice, had not touched anyone, had not moved toward any restricted area, and had placed a reservation inquiry at the desk before being asked to step aside. He walked to Mason and introduced himself by name and position, and asked whether Mason would be willing to step into a side conference room to resolve the situation away from the main floor. Mason said yes without hesitation. Celeste intervened before they could move, telling Elliot that she needed Mason escorted through the main entrance rather than handled privately, because she wanted the visual record to be clear for anyone observing that the hotel's standards were being enforced. Elliot received this instruction with the expression of a career security professional who was going to log the order precisely as given and carry it out in a way that incurred the minimum possible risk to everyone involved. He asked Mason to accompany him toward the front entrance, and Mason stood and picked up his bag and the envelope and asked whether he would be given back his documents and the ring. Preston said the photograph would be retained by the hotel's security department for investigation of potentially fraudulent materials. Mason looked at Celeste directly and asked whether she intended to return the photograph if it turned out to be genuine. She told him that if the photograph was authenticated as real, she would personally apologize to him in front of every guest in the lobby. She said it with the complete certainty of a person who believed she was not taking any risk, and she said it in front of the board members and the staff and the guests drifting through the space. Elliot quietly switched the lobby camera system to an independent archive mode that backed up to an off server, a protocol that existed in the hotel's infrastructure for insurance purposes and had never been used to document an interaction of this kind. Tessa, who had been directed to the staff office but had not yet reached it, stopped at a house phone, lifted the receiver, and dialed the number printed at the bottom of the reservation confirmation because it was the only number she knew to call. Marion Shaw answered on the second ring from her office, where she had been waiting to hear that Mason had arrived and settled. Tessa told her what had happened in 4 sentences, and the silence on the other end lasted long enough that Tessa thought the call had dropped. Then Marion said she was calling Gideon immediately, ended the call, opened the encrypted message she had been waiting on, and read the confirmation line that placed the probability of paternity at 99.99%. Gideon Ashcroft had spent the flight from Boston reading through the expansion proposal Celeste had sent him, not because he needed to review it, but because he was the kind of man who read documents carefully before meetings, even when he already knew the outcome, as a way of honoring the work his people had put into them. He was 74 years old and had built the Ashcroft Hotel Group from a condemned building in Lower Manhattan that he had purchased with borrowed money at the age of 31, and he had not yet reached the point in his life where he felt comfortable moving through the world on assumption. Marian's call came through the aircraft's satellite connection at 7:40 in the evening, and her voice was steady in the way that people who deliver significant information professionally learn to make it sound. She told him that the laboratory had sent the final confirmation. He sat with that sentence for a moment before asking her to read the percentage aloud. She did. He looked out the window at the dark below the plane and said nothing for several seconds. He asked her to read from the end of Abigail's letter, the passage she had described briefly when she first made contact, the one written but never sent that had sat folded inside a ring box, inside a storage unit outside Springfield for more than 4 decades. Marian read the closing lines. Abigail had written that she was not asking anything of anyone, that she had made her choices, but that she wanted Mason to know, if he ever chose to seek the truth, that the man whose blood he carried had not known he existed, and that whatever his father had or had not done in the years after, the beginning had not been abandonment. Gideon asked where Mason was. Marian told him that Celeste had voided his reservation and that the hotel's security staff had been asked to escort him from the building. The silence that followed was different from the first one. It had a quality that people who had worked closely with Gideon Ashcroft for years had learned to identify, not as anger exactly, but as the moment a decision was made that would not be revisited. He pressed the intercom for the flight crew and told them he needed the car to be at the base of the air stairs before the wheels stopped. He called Preston's direct line and heard no answer. He called Celeste number 3 times and heard voicemail each time because she had set her phone to silent for the board dinner and assumed her father was calling about the agenda. When the aircraft landed and the door opened, Gideon was already at the top of the stairs in his coat, and the driver had to move quickly to keep pace as he crossed the tarmac. He did not speak during the drive. He looked at the laboratory document once more, not because he doubted it, but because he was preparing himself for the experience of meeting someone who had spent 42 years without a father and was now, by every legal and biological measure, his son. He had no right to expect anything from that meeting, no claim on forgiveness, on gratitude, on even basic warmth, and he understood that, and it did not make him move any slower. The convoy of 3 vehicles arrived at Ashcroft Imperial's main entrance at 7:58 in the evening, and Celeste was standing in the lobby near the board members when a bellhop told her that her father's cars were at the door. She arranged her expression into a composed welcome and walked toward the entrance because she had expected him to arrive in time for the final portion of the dinner, and had prepared her remarks for an audience that now included him. She was 3 steps from the revolving door when Gideon came through it and walked past her without making eye contact, without slowing, without returning the hand she extended toward his arm. He walked as if she were a fixture in the room rather than the person who ran the company, and the board members who were watching understood immediately that something had changed in the 4 hours since they had last spoken with him. He stopped when he saw Mason near the edge of the entrance area, standing with his bag and the envelope, in the process of being guided toward the door by Elliot's team. Gideon looked at the man's face for a long moment, long enough that the movement in the lobby slowed around the stillness of it. He was looking for the things a person looks for when they already know the answer, but need to see it confirmed by something other than a document, the line of the jaw, the shape of the eyes, the way a person holds himself under pressure when he has nothing left to prove. Mason looked back at him without yet knowing who he was looking at, only that the man who had just entered the building had walked past the CEO of the company that owned it as if she were furniture. Gideon asked him his mother's name. Mason said, "Abigail Hart." Gideon's hands did not visibly shake, but the people near enough to see his face watched something move across it that none of them could name. He took from Marion, who had arrived in the lobby 2 minutes earlier and positioned herself near the corridor, a sealed envelope containing the printed laboratory report, and he held it without opening it. He looked at the ring on the edge of the desk, the one Celeste had placed down with too much force, the one Tessa had returned to Mason. And he said that he had given that ring to Abigail on the night the first hotel opened, and that he had told her it was not a gift from family money, but from the first profit the building had made on its own. Mason asked him whether he had known about the pregnancy. Gideon said no, with no explanations attached and no reconfiguring of the circumstances that followed, because he understood that an explanation offered before it is requested is usually an attempt to redirect the listener's sympathy rather than tell the truth. He said only that he had believed what his father told him, and that he had not done what a man who truly loved someone would have done, which was to go and find out for himself. Then he stepped forward and put his arms around Mason Hart, and in a voice that was not loud but was heard by everyone in the space immediately around them, he said, "Son." Mason stood with his arms at his sides. He was not unmoved. He had spent most of the bus ride from Missouri preparing himself to meet a man who might be cold or dismissive or contractual, not a man who would weep openly in the lobby of his own hotel. Celeste had moved backward in the seconds after that word landed and found the arm of a chair with the back of her knee and sat down in the way that people sit down when their legs make the decision without them. The man she had publicly called a fortune hunter and a fraud was her father's blood. He had been in this building all evening, and she had spent every minute of that time working to erase him. Marion opened the folder she was carrying and placed the laboratory report on the front desk with both hands flat on either side of it, as if presenting evidence in a courtroom, which, in every relevant sense, she was. She said that the analysis had been conducted at 2 separate accredited facilities and cross-referenced by an independent scientific review, that the chain of custody for both samples had been maintained without interruption, and that the conclusion carried full legal standing in any jurisdiction where it might be presented. The percentage printed at the bottom of the first page was not an estimate or a preliminary finding. It was a final determination. Celeste said that she had acted to protect the family from someone who had not yet been verified, which was technically accurate about the first few minutes of Mason's arrival, and factually insufficient for everything that had followed. Mason looked at her and asked a question in a voice without elevation, delivered as a plain sequence of facts. He asked whether protecting the family had required voiding a reservation that had been properly confirmed and paid for, whether it had required suggesting publicly that he could not afford a hotel room that someone else had already paid for, whether it had required placing his mother's ring onto a counter with open contempt, whether it had required suspending the only employee in the building who had pointed out that what was happening was wrong, whether it had required offering him money to sign a document agreeing to disappear. No one in the lobby answered. Gideon looked at Celeste with an expression that was not rage. Rage would have been easier because rage is impersonal, but with the specific, difficult expression of a person who is recalculating what they understand about someone they raised. He reminded her that she had made a promise in front of witnesses and told her it was time to keep it. Celeste stood and said that she owed Mason an apology for the misunderstanding. Mason told her quietly that calling it a misunderstanding was not the same as naming what she had done, and that he would receive the apology when she said what the apology was actually for. After a long pause, Celeste said that she had judged him based on how he was dressed and where he came from, and that she had acted as if those things were a reliable measure of who he was. Mason received this without performance and did not rush toward absolution. Marian then turned to the second document in her folder and explained that the Ashcroft Family Trust contained a provision established specifically to address the possibility of a biological heir separated from the family by circumstance rather than by choice, and that under that provision, any verified child of Gideon Ashcroft was entitled to a voting share in the group's holdings, a seat on the family council, access to all financial records held by the trust, and a beneficial interest in the original Ashcroft property. What this meant, in practical terms, was that Mason now held a formal governance stake that exceeded Preston's authority in every meaningful way and positioned him as a stakeholder whose consent would be required for certain decisions, including decisions about who held the CEO role. Celeste understood. The man she had tried to push through the front door at 8 o'clock in the evening now had more formal influence over her position than she had over his. The alarm from the ballroom wing came through the building's monitoring system at 9:14, which was precisely the interval Mason had estimated when he had mentioned the compression pattern in the air handling unit earlier that evening. The hotel's event coordinator appeared at the desk to report that the temperature in the main ballroom had begun rising. The cooling system serving the catering prep area had gone offline, and more than 200 guests were scheduled to arrive in less than 40 minutes, with a significant portion of the evening's food requiring controlled storage conditions. Preston went pale in the specific way of a person who has received bad news he already knew was coming and had hoped, without any rational basis, would not arrive tonight. Mason did not wait to be asked. He told Gideon's technical liaison that he needed access to the mechanical room on the building's third sublevel, and Gideon, without consulting anyone, nodded. In the mechanical room, Mason found what he had expected: a control board with a relay switch that had been vibrating loose over a period of weeks, the kind of slow deterioration that shows up in maintenance logs as a low priority flag and stays there unless someone reclassifies it as urgent. He found the maintenance record for that unit on the tablet mounted near the access panel and saw that it had been flagged 4 times over the past 3 months and marked as non-critical each time, overridden by a notation bearing Preston's authorization code. He isolated the failing unit from the primary load by rerouting distribution through the backup processor, a process that took 11 minutes and required no special tools beyond what he had carried into the hotel that morning in the kit he had been mocked for. The ballroom's system stabilized. The event coordinator confirmed that temperatures were returning to range. The guests arrived to a room that felt exactly as it was supposed to feel. When Mason came back up to the lobby and one of Gideon's own engineers asked how he had known where to look, Mason said that he had heard the interval pattern from the lobby floor and recognized it because he had corrected the same fault in a school gymnasium in southeastern Missouri 2 winters earlier. One of the event technicians present during the repair told Gideon that the maintenance records showed a systematic pattern of deliberate reclassification, serious flags being downgraded through an authorization chain running directly through Preston's office, with the cost savings applied as a line item to the operating bonus structure that benefited Preston personally. Gideon requested that all financial and maintenance records for the property be frozen and transferred immediately to an external audit firm. Celeste's signature appeared on 3 approval memos for the cost reduction measures, though the technical appendices that explained what was being cut had not been attached to the versions she had signed. Mason said, when Gideon asked him later what he thought should follow, that a person's blood gave them a place at the table, but that what they did once they were seated was the only thing that determined whether they deserved to stay there. He said it without looking at Celeste, because he was not saying it to wound her. He was saying it because he had believed it for 42 years before he ever knew the name Ashcroft. and he was not about to revise it simply because the name now applied to him. The audit firm's preliminary findings arrived within 72 hours, and what they documented extended well beyond the maintenance records. A pattern spanning at least 4 years showed that Ashcroft Imperial, under Preston's management, had applied a systematic process for handling guests whose appearance or initial transaction suggested limited spending capacity, a process that had never been put into policy because writing it down would have made it a policy, and so had been transmitted through informal instruction, institutional expectation, and a bonus structure that rewarded room yield over guest satisfaction. Reservations were voided on technical pretexts. Cards were run for deposits exceeding what the system required. Guests who disputed these actions were told the hotel had experienced system errors that unfortunately could not be reversed. The rooms were then reassigned to walk-in guests willing to pay elevated rates, and the difference was logged in a way that obscured the original transaction. Tessa Monroe had submitted 3 formal complaints through the hotel's internal process, each of which had been received by Preston's administrative coordinator and resolved without escalation. Celeste had received summarized operational reports for the property quarterly and had not flagged the guest satisfaction disparity that appeared in those reports, though the disparity was visible in the underlying data if one looked at the right columns. Gideon terminated Preston's employment before the week was out, citing breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent record-keeping, and conduct he described in the termination letter as incompatible with the founding principles of Ashcroft Grand Hotels. Celeste's authority was suspended pending the completion of the independent review, with a board-appointed interim structure placed in operational control. She was not removed from the family and was not stripped of her equity because Gideon was not in the business of punishment beyond what accountability required. But he made clear to her, in a private conversation she would carry for a long time, that the reason for her suspension was not that she had failed to recognize her half-brother. It was that she had treated a stranger as someone beneath the protection of basic decency, and had used the authority of her position to enforce that treatment. Tessa was reinstated the following morning and received a formal apology from the interim general manager on behalf of the property. Elliot was commended in writing for maintaining the archive record and for handling the confrontation in a manner that had avoided physical escalation. Mason, when consulted about the employees who had carried out Preston's directives without personally adding to the humiliation of the evening, said that people who follow orders are not the same as people who write them, and that his own experience with systems that could be corrected was that it was more useful to fix the process than to dismiss everyone inside it. The staff noticed that Mason drew this distinction clearly. Some of them noticed it before they knew anything about the DNA result, which meant they were responding to the person rather than to the bloodline. Gideon offered Mason the family penthouse that same night and suggested a company car and a meeting with the group's chief legal counsel in the morning to begin formalizing Mason's position in the trust. Mason thanked him and declined both for the time being. He said he had a daughter at home who was 15 years old and who had been told only that her father was traveling for a meeting, and that he did not want to call her and describe his circumstances in a way that would require her to understand 4 decades of other people's decisions before she had finished her sophomore year. He said he needed time to learn who Gideon actually was before he could decide what kind of presence the man would be in his life, and that relationships built in the middle of a crisis tended to need to be rebuilt afterward on something steadier. Gideon accepted this without argument, without retreating into the formal distance that wealthy people sometimes used when their gestures were declined, because he understood that what Mason was telling him was not a rejection. It was the boundary of a person who had been self-sufficient by necessity for his entire adult life and was not going to abandon that self-sufficiency because a document said he was entitled to something different. Mason agreed to accept the board seat designated for family members in the trust's governance structure, with responsibility for service standards and employee welfare across the group's properties, on the condition that his decisions in that role would be his own and not managed through intermediaries. Celeste asked to speak with him privately that evening before he went upstairs, and he agreed. She told him that she had spent the 3 hours after Gideon's arrival going over the sequence of decisions she had made from the moment Preston called her, and that she could not find a single point in that sequence where she had actually stopped to consider whether she was doing something wrong, because she had been so certain from the beginning that she already knew what was happening. She said she believed the certainty had come from fear that someone was going to walk into the building and take something she had spent her whole career building, and that the fear had felt like judgment, but had really been terror. Mason listened and did not try to resolve it for her. He said he had not come to Manhattan to take anything, and that nothing had been taken from her, that she had not surrendered by her own choices. He said he was not able to forgive her quickly, but that he was not going to ask their father to remove her from a family she had been part of her entire life. He told her that when the time came for her to return to the company, it would not be through a door he opened. It would be through a standard she met. When the evening had wound down and the board members had gone and the lobby had settled into its late-night quiet, Gideon asked if Mason would like to be moved to one of the property's premier suites. Mason said he would like to stay in the standard room that Marian had originally reserved, the one that had been booked for him before any of the events of the evening had occurred, the one that had been paid for and erased and then paid for again. Tessa was back on shift by then and processed the room assignment herself, holding out the key card with both hands in a gesture that carried more in it than a standard handover. Mason took it, then told her that he did not need different treatment from anyone on the staff, and that what he would remember from the evening was not that one person had given him a hard time, but that one person had done the right thing without being asked, and that the second kind of memory was the one worth keeping. He went upstairs and called Leah from the edge of the bed. She answered on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting. He told her that the result had come back and that the man the laboratory report named as his biological father was alive and had not known of Mason's existence until that evening. He said that her grandfather, by blood, was a man named Gideon who had built something large from almost nothing, which was a thing she might find interesting someday when she was ready to hear more about it. Leah asked whether he was all right, and Mason said he was, more or less, which was honest. In the months that followed, Ashcroft Imperial changed in ways that were procedural and visible, and some that were neither. Reservation records could no longer be modified by a single manager's authorization after a booking had been confirmed. Employee complaints were routed to a review panel operating independently of property management. Performance evaluations for managers incorporated staff satisfaction data weighted equally with revenue metrics. Maintenance reports could be downgraded in severity only through a documented dual approval process that left an unalterable record. Employees were formally authorized to refuse directives they identified as discriminatory, with protection from retaliation written into the updated conduct policy. Mason held his board seat and continued, wearing the same clothes he had always worn when he visited the property unannounced, arriving through the lobby like any ordinary guest and watching how the staff moved through their work when no one of consequence appeared to be observing. Celeste returned to an operational role more than a year later, beginning not in the executive suite but at the front desk, working a standard shift alongside people who had no particular reason to make things easy for her and were not asked to. On the wall of the lobby near the entrance, at Gideon's instruction, there hung the old photograph that had been carried across the country inside a plain white envelope. Abigail Hart and a young Gideon Ashcroft standing together outside the first hotel, before any of it had grown into an empire. The caption beneath it read, "A guest's worth cannot be measured by the price of what they wear." Mason stood in front of that photograph on the morning it was installed and looked at his mother's face, young and clear-eyed in the light of a long Ago evening. Then he looked at Gideon, who was standing a few feet to his right, with his hands folded and his eyes on the same image. He could not yet say the word the way it was meant to sound. But when Gideon said, "Son," in the quiet of the lobby that morning, Mason did not look away.
I'm gonna keep my pilgrim fit. Hi, Bellabone. How you doing today? Welcome in. Welcome in. How you doing? Set. Reignite. I'm doing good, Bella. Thanks so much for asking. Having a good day today. Critical. How does the critical hit work, guys? Like, should I go back? Or should I keep pillar stance, guys? What do you think? Down level increases damage dealt by all varied combos. I go back, but up to you. What's up, back from surgery? What's up, bro? How'd it go? Pretty chill? Let's go. Yeah, I've always used Smash Dance too.